Hello again. So now we'll continue discussing speciation models, and we have three main models. The most common being allopatric speciation, and parapatric and sympatric speciation are also important and well documented ways to that species divides into two or more groups. So allopatric speciation involves a physical disruption of gene flow between two or more populations of a main original population. In one scenario, you might have a geographical barrier to the dispersal. In another scenario, you might have a group of founder individuals colonizing some other area and not being able to continue gene flow with the original population. And the end result is a genetic differentiation between the two groups and a new species rising. In parapatric speciation, distinctively, the distinctive feature is having a gradient. There's an environmental gradient that involves local adaptation, and the organisms living on one side or the other side of the gradient evolve different adaptations, and you end up with a hybrid zone, and there might be selection against hybridization. We'll see more details of this. This is parapatric speciation, but there's a gradient. And in sympatric speciation, you have the original population with no boundaries, no gradient either. But you can have environmental heterogeneity, or you can have genetic events that lead to the emergence of two or more groups within the same region, where there is no physical barrier between the groups, but environmental heterogeneity or polyploidy can lead to such outcomes, species emerging in sympatry, allopatry, parapatry, sympatry. So first we'll discuss allopatry. There's a demonstration of what kind of event, what series of events happen. Originally, we have a single group, and then this is divided into two by a physical barrier. Could be a mountain range, could be a river, or anything. In chimps and bonobos, for instance, have been split by the Congo River like this, and because they cannot swim, the river has become a barrier. And then you can have, initially, of course, the population will be carrying more or less the same polymorphisms, but you know that by drift, you will have the two populations differentiating over time, just neutrally differentiating, and each of the originally shared polymorphisms alleles are fixing in different populations. So the same allele can also fix, but different alleles can also fix, so leading to divergence. You can have local adaptation, you will have new mutations appearing, you can also have selfish genetic elements that fix in either population, and so that eventually when we study these populations after some point, they have become different enough that even if they are allowed to, they are brought together by environmental changes or by humans, they won't mate, they won't find each other attractive, or their offspring won't be viable or fertile. Yeah, so there's geographic isolation, genetic drift, mutations, local adaptation, selfish elements. So drift nearly always happens. If there's enough time, new mutations will also contribute. Of course, how much adaptation and selfish elements contribute, that will depend. End result is differentiation of the gene pools, and that will eventually lead to reproductive isolation, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. We'll discuss this more later, but yeah, if we wait enough time, we're sure that to have reproductive isolation between the two groups, even if they're brought together, they won't mate or produce fertile offspring. And yeah, so this is the process. And here, importantly, we don't assume a hybrid zone appearing. different from parapatric speciation. I said the drift alone could contribute to speciation, and it could drive speciation. Neutral sequence divergence, there's no functional genes, could also drive speciation, because in sexually reproducing organisms, because you know that you need to have some degree of sequence homology and karyotype homology for meiosis to be performed functionally successfully. So if there's too much sequence divergence, too much karyotype remodeling in either population, when they come together, the hybrids, the heterozygotes won't be able to perform meiosis successfully, and can lead to hybrid sterility, even if the hybrids themselves are healthy. And we also mentioned meiotic drive elements, so selfish elements can further speed up this process without even local adaptation. And then local adaptation will be yet another factor that might lead to genetic differentiation and incompatibilities. We talked about two alternative submodels of allopatric speciation. The dumbbell model or the vicariance model involves a split of original population into two or more, but the peripheral isolated model involves founder effect. And if I asked you which of these two models would you expect to occur faster, you might already guess that drift would be expected to be faster here, and thus and also it involves, of course, colonization of a new area, so we might expect the peripheral isolate model to involve faster events of speciation on average. Some examples: so shrimp living on two sides of the Americas, on Atlantic and the Pacific sides. And when the Panama Isthmus closed a few million years ago, shrimp species living on both sides, they were cut off from each other. And we can identify the species, so some of the species that live on either sides of the Panama Isthmus today, they are sisters. So we have different pairs of sisters that are representatives of different species that were single species in the past here. But these sister species, although they look alike and they get along with each other if they're put together, and even mate, still those matings apparently rarely produce viable offspring. So the time that passed drove them towards reproductive isolation, large-scale reproductive isolation. And the other model, the peripheral isolate model, we have many examples of this as well. This is a spruce, interactioned black and red spruce, and these guys, they after in recent times, one of the species, the black spruce, the original species, was a source of a colonization event which led to the emergence of red spruce, you see here. And so the black spruce is normally living in more northern areas, and then it colonized more southern areas of the Americas. Yeah, unfortunately, all our examples are from Americas. And as you see, mitochondrial haplotypes, so different sequences, commonly found sequences in mitochondria, those are haplotypes, are quite diverse in the black spruce, but they're pretty uniform, only containing two haplotypes in red spruce. And in this case, the red spruce would represent the peripheral isolate, and we see the effect of genetic drift here already. Okay, so that's allopathic speciation. As we mentioned, that's one of the most common, probably the most common speciation process in nature. But people have also documented other processes. So one of the interesting cases here is paraphyletic speciation. Here we don't have a barrier, but we have a cline of some environmental parameter. It could be, altitude. It could be some the amount of resources, proximity. Yeah, could be. What else? Altitude is a common example. It could be temperature. It could also be some properties of the environment, like the soil. We'll see an example like that. And then what we have is a selection and local adaptation of these species. Of these populations, which are originally a single population, that leads to their divergence. So phenotypic divergence, specific adaptations, while gene flow is continuing. But when this happens, you can expect that the hybrids might have lower fitness. So gene flow might be detrimental to local adaptation. This is probably a pretty obvious statement. When there's gene flow, it will, from outside, from external sources, it will weaken local adaptation. And so you can have start having a selection against hybrids. And this can lead to the stopping of gene flow between the two groups. So evolution of characters, reproductive isolation evolving through selection, and gene flow ceasing between the two between the populations. How such reproductive isolation can evolve, we'll discuss later. We already saw some cases where not exactly we could call this a gradient or environmental two types of environment in the same region. And we discussed this example where different phenotypes are more adapted to either of the environments, which are next to each other. And you can, in this situation, if you have had local adaptation, so the black dark color and light color, you might imagine are products of local adaptation, whichever is ancestral, doesn't matter. So if we have such two locally adapted groups, then any mating between them can cause trouble in that the hybrids could be, we can imagine two scenarios. The hybrids could show intermediate dominance, but that might not be, so they might not be as fit as their parental groups, because their intermediate don't do well here or here. The phenotype, one of the phenotypes, one of the traits might be dominant, but then such dominant, such heterozygous individuals showing the dominant trait, whenever they mate with each other, some of the F2 will contain mismatched individuals. So again, you will have some of the hybrids being lost eventually in the F1 or in the F2 due to mismatches to the environment, so lack of local adaptation, misadaptation. So this situation will cause selection against hybridization. And if there are any alleles, so this is the important point, under such circumstances, whenever there's selection pressure against hybridization, this means any allele that arises that promotes assortative mating, that promotes mating of individuals with only their own type. So yellow with yellow, black with black. So some kind of, you could think of these as racist alleles. Any racist alleles will be positively selected if hybrids are selected against. Okay. So if there's selection against hybridization, you eventually reproductive isolation mechanisms will evolve, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. It will depend. And the gene flow will reduce and eventually stop, and you can have two species emerge. But you can also have situations where hybrids themselves have higher fitness in the hybrid zone. Then you might see the emergence of three species. So take this case, we have a coast and temperature varies along the coast. There are two extremes and then gradient in between. And then you might have adaptations specific to the cold environment and to the warm environment, and then hybrids appearing by mating between these two groups. And hybrids might be worse off, or hybrids might be, alternately, they could be also adapted to this more heterogeneous, potentially more heterogeneous environment. Let's say, and in the book, there are cases of both situations, examples of both situations. So this is type of grass that normally lives, of course, in normal soils, but then has also managed to colonize mine areas where there's a lot of toxic elements in the soil. And these populations apparently, they can still exchange genes with the ancestral pasture population. Here we see zinc tolerance. So the mine plants are much more zinc tolerant, but they tend to, apparently people have found different features that suggest that there is lower gene flow between the low gene flow between the pasture populations and the mine populations, and that suggests that there might be selection against hybridization. Their flowering times are different, things like that. So in this situation, we might expect there to be even more selection and hybridization eventually totally being cut off, stopping, and gene flow being cut off and two species merging. But here we have another example. So fitness and environment and three genotypes, basically, or three groups, three populations grown in these three environments. The mountain population is shown in green. The basin population is shown in red. Their fitnesses are highest in their own environments, and the hybrid fitness is highest in the hybrid zone, in the intermediate zone. And in this case, you might again expect selection against hybridization, but the hybrids themselves might also stop gene flow with either of the parent populations, and the end result would be the emergence of three species. Okay. Now we'll talk about another interesting case, ring species, kind of related to paraphyletic species. So ring species, this is a famous phenomenon observed in different organisms, not very frequently, but we have a couple of examples there. And how it works is as follows. So we have, across some kind of geographical area, which creates some kind of ring-like structure, we have a number of populations where every population can exchange alleles with its neighbors. Okay, so 6 can exchange alleles with 7 and 5, 5 with 2 and 6, etc. So there's continuous gene flow along the populations, but on the two extremes of this ring, so-called ring, the two extremes are too different to be able to reproduce. So there is actually gene flow between them. So they all, in the biological species concept terms, these are not totally isolated. They would be part of the same species, but if you directly try to mate them, they don't mate. They don't find each other attractive, or they're incompatible, whatever. And how this happens? So differentiation is gradual. So 8 is exchanges genes with 7, so, and shares some ancestry, shares some alleles, but not all alleles. And either by drift or selection, differentiation between the two ends becomes too much to allow them to successfully reproduce. Yeah, you need some kind of Klein or some space, circular space, for this to emerge. Yeah, can be driven by both allopathic and parapathic mechanisms. And here's one example. I'm not sure. We have this is California, and we have a mountain range here, and some I guess salamander species living on two sides of the mountain range. And as you see, so the colors indicate the colors which blend into each other, suggest that these guys actually can mate. Still, they're so-called subspecies of the same group, in Satina, blah blah, and some they have a third name, as you see. So green with the blue, and blue with the purple, purple with the dark blue, and purple red also works. But and purple with yellow also works, but yellow doesn't mix with green, as you see here. So probably we can imagine these were also connected in the past, but now they're broken. But these guys somehow don't mix. And this guy also doesn't mix with the green. So on one side, they are connected, or they have been connected until recently, but on the other side, not. This is kind of a cool, yeah, the ring species, I think, is a cool phenomenon. Another case from another book. These are warblers that have been that have colonized Asia, so they live around Asia. Again, there seems to be a gap here, but you can imagine these two populations were connected, and yellow and green, and green and blue, and blue and purple can mate. Yellow and this red type can also mate, but blue and red or orange, they cannot mate. They're too different. They don't like each other, apparently. And here we see their chirping records, and as they've differentiated, their chirping patterns have also differentiated. So here, these two guys apparently have two different chirping patterns to find each other's chirping attractive. Yeah. In Siberia, they behave like different species. Also, their feather patterns are apparently different. And our last case is sympatric speciation. So here we're talking about speciation without boundaries, and the book has this case of two cichlids in Lake Apoyo, small lake, shallow, without boundaries. And we have two sister species that don't seem that have seemed to seize the gene flow between them, and apparently they have actually evolved from the same ancestor. They don't have independent origins. How could this be explained? Well, apparently they have different um, ways of finding food. So they one focuses on biofilm, but also eats a lot of algae and uses different parts of the lake. Whereas this guy mainly eats biofilm and some insects, blah blah. So this differentiation, eventually local adaptation in the same environment, resource specialization, you could also call this resource specialization as lead-driven speciation. So this is a case of ecological divergence in a heterogeneous environment, no boundaries, but environmental heterogeneity, resource heterogeneity, and that leads to local adaptation, so resource specialization. And then you can have assorted mating, selection against hybrids, and a gene flow seizing between the two groups. So this is one path to sympatric speciation. The alternative path is totally different. You can also have within the same population new groups emerge by polyploidy, autopolyploidy or allopolyploidy. We'll see in a second. Okay, let's first discuss ecological divergence-driven sympatric speciation, and there's this famous case of these flies, hawthorn flies. Hawthorn is a lich, and these flies were their ancestral niche were hawthorns, and they grew on these trees. I'm not sure which one is hawthorn tree and which one is this. Probably hawthorn tree. No, are the ones on mid campus are of course much smaller. Anyway, but yeah, so these were specialized on hawthorns, these flies, but in over the last 200 years or something, apples were brought to North America, and apple or yeah, in big apple orchards, however they're called, these flies started to grow, and they started adapting to apple and to the apple trees, eating fruit from using apple as their food source, and also their meeting ground, and where they lay eggs, etc. So this has led to, in the same environment without any boundary between them, this has led to a new species arising, or an incipient species, where the new group has adapted to apple fruiting times, for instance, and so the gene flow with the original hawthorn population, which still continues to exist, with the gene flow with the original population has been limited. And there's the book describes this interesting experiment with hawthorn-like flies subjected to selection in an apple environment. So just for one generation, and they sequenced the genomes of these guys and compared it. So they identified allele frequency changes upon selection, and they found that across 154 loci, allele frequencies were shifted towards the apple population from the original population. Apple population allele frequencies are shown in green. Pink shows the hawthorn-like frequencies. Hawthorne-like populations frequencies, and so they basically shifted from this pink curve to the blue curve in one generation, which is pretty amazing. And the question I could ask you based on this is whether you could conclude whether this adaptation to Apple or Hawthorne's local adaptation, would you guess this is a polygenic trait or Mendelian trait? Answer should be obvious, but anyway, if you have any doubts, we can discuss during this stage. Okay, so this is this kind of ecological heterogeneity can lead to disruptive selection and then assortative mating. You can also have disruptive selection plus spatial segregation, even without assortative mating. Flies might not have the chance to, flies living on hawthorn trees and apple trees, they might not have a chance to meet each other and mate with each other efficiently as much as they were using the same tree. And the end result would be, in any case, speciation. And disruptive selection itself can be caused by resource competition. This is also something to keep in mind. So if we have the distribution of a resource, for instance, if these funny birds are eating seeds and most seeds are of intermediate size, here shown in red, the size of, seed size distribution. The most are of intermediate size, then being of intermediate size would make sense and would have relatively high fitness. And we would expect there to be stabilizing selection with the average beak size fitting the average seed size. It's unimodal distribution. But if the distribution of the resources is wide and relatively shallow, uniform-like, then being of intermediate size doesn't bring any advantage. It might even bring disadvantage in that these guys can use more of the more resources that an average beak size bird cannot use. These guys as well. So being at the two extremes might be beneficial, and that will lead to disruptive selection, and that can lead to further sympatric speciation. As we mentioned, there's yet another distinct path to sympatric speciation, and that's polyploidy. So you might have allopolyploidy, that is hybridization between two distinct but not totally far away species, or you can have autopolyploidy caused by double fertilization or endomitosis. The end result in general is sterile offspring or offspring with low fertility. But if polyploids can do asexual propagation in plants, this is very easy, as you know, but many animals, females can also asexually clone themselves. Pathogenesis is one way of doing that. Then new species can emerge. And this event, it doesn't involve necessarily a selection, and it happens pretty abruptly. So if the hybrid is successful in outcompeting the original groups, at least in certain areas, then you will have the emergence of a species, right away. Just a reminder of what autopolyploidy and allopolyploidy meant and why these usually lead to lack of fertile offspring. Why do it lead to sterility? Well, basically, if you have a triploid organism, for instance, when it's doing meiosis, the meiotic mechanism of separating homologous chromosomes, it assumes everything is even. That for each chromosome you have two, for each chromosome type you have two copies. Then they're separated by the chiasmata, as you might remember. But of course, if you have three copies here, then each of the germ cells will receive randomly either one or two copies of each set of chromatids, and this imbalance will cause problems. Sometimes such organisms can produce viable gametes, but their proportion will be low, or it might be also, if there are many chromosomes, of course, in the species, it might be close to impossible as well. But yeah, even if the offspring aren't fertile, you can have asexual propagation, as we mentioned. So there is in East Anatolia and also in Caucasus in Armenia, these lizards which have produced new species through hybridization and parthenogenesis. So these guys are just females, and they have different species as father and mother, but they cannot do sexual reproduction, as far as we know. And yeah, there are multiple instances of such hybrid lizards in that region, the Caucasus. Tarevsky is the name. And finally, reproductive isolation. But this will be another session.